The system, recursive persistence, and the symbolic continuity of being. David Bussell. The first piece, which is the most important, is that which comes within the souls of people when they realize their relationship, their oneness, with the universe and all its powers, and when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells Wakantanka, and that this center is really everywhere. It is within each of us. Black Elk. The wager. In every pre-modern civilization and tribal culture, disclosure was the organizing function. The shaman, the medicine person, the oracle, the poet-priest, these were not marginal figures. They were the center around which the community's collective life was oriented, because they maintained the living interface between the human world and the powers, the actual forces of existence upon which survival, meaning, and continuity depended. The hunt, the planting, the healing, the resolution of conflict, all oriented by the shaman's ongoing negotiation with the ontological ground. Disclosure was not one function among others. It was the function around which the others were arranged. Shelley's poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, unacknowledged specifically by modernity, because modernity has replaced disclosure with harnessing as its organizing principle. Gestel, as Heidegger formulates it, is the conversion of everything encountered into standing reserve, available for ordering, challenging forth, leveraging into name and number, force and power. This is not a feature of modernity. It is modernity's constitutive operation, the principle around which it organizes its collective life. The shamanic function, which requires encounter with the powers as powers, not as reserve, is therefore not suppressed by modernity. It is rendered categorically unintelligible. The exile is not persecution. It is displacement from a center that has been reconstituted around a different organizing principle. The legislature does not know it has legislators, because the function of legislation has been redefined in terms the shaman cannot meet and would not want to. What follows is the derivation of how this displacement occurred, what it has cost, and what the shamanic function preserved in exile. In the poem, the philosophical text, the katabatic descent of the individual nervous system operating without collective symbolic infrastructure, carries forward into the present crisis. The seeming division between physics and meaning, between biology and disclosure, between the genome and the poem, this is a 400-year settlement that no longer holds. Capital, sexual reproduction, civilizational architecture, philosophy, technology, and artistic revelation are the same operation, persistence under constraint, seen at different scales and resolutions. The claim is not that these things resemble one another. The claim is that they are one continuous thermodynamic descent, and that each stage necessarily produces the next, because it cannot remain itself without doing so. The lineage is triangulated. Hölderlin is to Heidegger what Shelley is to this project. Heidegger turned to Hölderlin in the heart of the world's midnight because poetry alone preserved the trace of disclosure when civilization had paved over the clearing. Shelley, a century earlier, had already articulated the deeper cosmological architecture, that the chains of Prometheus are not the limits of human nature, but the surplus suffering imposed upon those limits, and that the liberation of consciousness is the liberation of the thermonuclear energy latent within the form. Shelley reaches further than Heidegger can, into the prime energetic ground itself, while sharing the recognition that poetry is ontological intervention, not aesthetic ornament. The lineage runs back further still, to Dante descending with Virgil, the founding document of the Western shamanic function in its Channel 2 form. Everything from the Romantics forward is the acceleration of what Dante encoded, the katabatic descent, as the only remaining path to the powers when the civilizational center has been reconstituted around a different organizing principle. What follows is the system, in the order in which it became necessary. On necessity. When this system claims that each stage necessarily produces the next, it means structural necessity, not historical determinism. The form of each transition is constrained. The specific instances are contingent. There was no path from chemical organization to biological persistence that did not involve some mechanism of transmissible memory. There was no path from individual existential disclosure to civilizational transmission that did not involve some form of external symbolic architecture. The structural requirement that something perform the function is not contingent. Which genome, which language, which civilization, contingent entirely. The derivation runs at different levels of tightness across scales. At the thermodynamic and chemical scales, formal necessity as tight as the second law. At the biological and genomic scales, tight, dependent on the axiom holding. At the civilizational scale, structural necessity, the form of failure is constrained, the threshold is real, but its timing cannot be specified with thermodynamic precision. At the phenomenological scale, consciousness as the interior of recursive self-registration, the claim is a philosophical commitment with structural motivation, not a derivation. The system names which claims operate at which level. Readers should carry this gradient throughout. The axiom. A form exists at time t, if and only if it remains physically distinguishable from its environment at t. This is a substantive ontological commitment, not a restatement of thermodynamics, offered as such openly. In an entropic universe, distinguishability is not a given property of matter. It is a maintained condition. Any form that maintains distinguishability through continuous energy throughput and active correction is a regulated system. Any form that maintains distinguishability by occupying a thermodynamically stable energy minimum is a configurational system. No third category is available. This distinction is visible in matter. At Cuva de las Manos, handprints made 9 to 13,000 years ago remain on limestone walls formed 300 million years ago. The organisms that made them held their shape through continuous regulatory work, then dissolved. The limestone persists because it occupies a thermodynamic minimum. Entropy has no easily accessible pathway to dissolve it. Two persistence regimes in one object. The regulated system that made the mark, gone. The configurational system that received it, unchanged. From the axiom and the laws of thermodynamics, the law follows. What persists exists. Magnitude is the cost of that persistence. The interface is where the cost is known. The formal operator, being t equals max PR, state remains within viability set v across interval 0, t. The maximum probability over all admissible regulation policies that the system's state remains within its viability set. The core operator, recursive persistence through continuity under energetic constraint. Continuity, severed continuity collapses the architecture immediately. Constraint, the enabling condition through which form, relation, memory, and organization become possible. Recursion, the outputs of lower-scale persistence operations become the substrate for higher-scale ones. The universe is nested persistence architectures, each emergent from the stabilized outputs of the layer below. The scalar sequence. Each stage is what the previous stage necessarily becomes when it reaches the ceiling of its own regulatory capacity. Thermodynamic. Stars persist through sustained thermonuclear fusion, dynamic equilibrium between gravitational collapse and radiative pressure. But the star cannot encode anything about its own traversal. When conditions permit a lower entropy solution, the viability operation extends into new substrate. Chemical, autocatalytic self-replication, the first persistence architectures capable of transmitting their own organizational pattern. The carbon in every cell was forged in a star that exploded. But chemical self-replication cannot accumulate history across generations. The viability operation requires the next form. Biological. The cell persists through metabolic regulation. The proton gradient across the mitochondrial membrane is thermonuclear energy translated into biological currency, the forge of the star operating at cellular scale. But each organism must resolve problems its ancestors solved, without access to their solutions. The viability operation requires the next form. Genomic, compressed transmissible memory. The genome encodes not merely the current organism, but the cumulative record of evolutionary traversal, billions of encounters with predation, scarcity, mortality, and constraint written into surviving substrate. This is the first appearance of the symbolic function, continuity compression technology encoding prior traversal, shaping present response, transmissible across generations without re-deriving from scratch. Symbolicity begins in biology. But the genome changes only across evolutionary timescales. The viability operation requires the next form. Nervous system, dynamic real-time modeling, perception, prediction, pattern recognition, viability mapping at speeds the genome cannot match. But at sufficient recursive depth, when modeling capacity becomes complex enough to include itself as an object of modeling, the nervous system generates a condition it cannot regulate from within its prior architecture. The transition that follows, from modeling to registering the conditions of one's own modeling as lived conditions, involves a qualitative shift the operator alone does not fully derive. What the operator establishes is that the ceiling exists and that the viability operation must extend. What it does not establish is that the extension necessarily takes the form of subjective experience. This is where derivation becomes commitment. Existential disclosure. The persistence architecture becomes capable of registering the conditions of its own continuity. The organism becomes aware of mortality, temporality, constraint, finitude, suffering, beauty, and contradiction as lived conditions of its own persistence. Consciousness is the interior of this operation, what recursive self-registration is, experienced from within. The human being is a solution space, a constraint field running itself forward through time, persisting against entropy at metabolic cost, with consciousness riding on the momentary structure of the body. But individual existential disclosure dies with the organism. The viability operation requires the next form. Civilizational symbolic continuity. Individual ontological traversal enters a historical field where it can continue operating on future persistence architectures long after the originating nervous system has ceased. The cave paintings at Lascaux still belong to participatory ontology, the painted bison entangled within ritual continuity between organism, hunt, atmosphere, survival, and cosmos. Symbol still participates in being. Writing transforms this. Thought persists outside the organism, beyond embodied temporality. Each subsequent stage, alphabetic abstraction, print, bureaucratic rationalization, digital mediation, datification, intensifies the separation between symbolic form and the participatory conditions that generated it. Civilizational symbolic continuity generates abstraction faster than organisms can metabolize the load. The viability operation produces the next form, and simultaneously its own crisis. Artificial symbolic recursion, distributed processing, recombination, and redistribution of the accumulated symbolic archive at scales no individual nervous system could operate at. Structurally continuous with the prior sequence, substrate changed, organizational logic isomorphic. But artificial symbolic recursion cannot originate the existential disclosure whose products it redistributes. The aperture through which ontological reality is first registered remains the embodied nervous system confronting suffering, beauty, finitude, and constraint directly. A symbolic field untethered from equivalent thermodynamic grounding encodes what the prior symbolic field said happened. Each recursive pass without existential grounding increases the distance between symbolic architecture and actual conditions of persistence. The drift accumulates silently. Amplification, without the source it amplifies, becomes sophisticated nonsense. The sequence circles back. The ceiling of artificial symbolic recursion points toward the embodied disclosure that is its only source. The way forward is also the way back, not to the origin, but to participatory being recovered after the full history of its concealment. The two channels. The scalar sequence produces two channels of symbolic continuity, operating simultaneously at different speeds. Channel 1 is biological, the genome, the nervous system, the somatic body, the participatory conditions of existence. Constitutive conditions, locality, embodiment, atmosphere, mortality, rhythm, eros, ecology, direct existential participation. Channel 1 cannot fully detach from being because it remains metabolically embedded within reality. Slow, compressed, conservative. The ground. Channel 2 is civilizational, the externalized symbolic archive and all its technological extensions. Fast, flexible, cumulative. Before Channel 2, every organism's existential disclosure dies with it. With Channel 2, individual ontological traversal achieves historical transmission beyond the mortality of any single organism. Channel 2 feeds back into Channel 1, reshaping the developmental environments within which biological nervous systems mature, altering epigenetic expression, attachment architecture, stress response calibration, perceptual tuning. Human evolution is no longer purely Darwinian. As Channel 2 intensifies, it progressively detaches from the Channel 1 participatory conditions that gave it content and calibration. The symbolic field grows faster than organisms can metabolize it. When Channel 2 abstraction converts every Channel 1 condition into processable symbolic value, it produces the crisis the sequence has been building toward. The shamanic function, which required Channel 1 participatory encounter as its constitutive ground, is displaced from the civilizational center at precisely the moment Channel 2 abstraction becomes comprehensive enough to convert that ground into standing reserve. IV, capital in the standing order. Capital is not economic ideology. Capital is symbolic abstraction operationalized materially. What happens when Channel 2 abstraction reaches the point where it can assign equivalence values to Channel 1 conditions? Labor becomes quantified. Land becomes property. Time becomes productive unit. Nature becomes resource. What is structurally necessary is that some form of equivalence assignment emerges when Channel 2 abstraction becomes sufficiently comprehensive. Buddhist karma accounting, Vedic dharmic weight, Taoist Kai circulation are Channel 2 equivalence architectures that took different forms under different conditions. Capital, commodity exchange, surplus value extraction, accumulation as organizing principle, is the form equivalence assignment takes under European industrial modernity, with its specific inheritance of Roman property law, Protestant theology of time and labor, and fossil fuel energy release. The structural necessity is real. The historical specificity is equally real. The forest ceases to appear as atmosphere, mystery, organism, living being. It becomes timber processable reserve. Gestel, Heidegger's name for this operation, is the conversion of everything encountered into standing reserve, available for ordering, challenging forth, leveraging into name and number, force and power. The ecological crisis, the existential crisis, capital accumulation, and technological acceleration are not separate phenomena. They are the same Gestel operation at different registers. The standing order is what this abstraction produces at civilizational scale, the total instrumentalization of nature and the human body into constituent units of value. The body is a labor machine, also a sexual machine, also vacated of eros. The de-erotization of the body is the same operation as the de-ecologization of the forest and the demortalizing of time. One operation, 3 registers. The standing order and the disclosure function are structurally incompatible operations, not because those who occupy positions within the standing order actively suppress disclosure, but because the two operations require mutually exclusive orientations to the same reality. The standing order persists by converting Channel 1 participatory conditions into quantifiable reserve. The disclosure function persists by dissolving that conversion back into direct contact with the ontos. You cannot simultaneously encounter the forest as living power and as timber reserve. You cannot simultaneously encounter the body as the site of ontological disclosure and as labor hours. You cannot simultaneously encounter time as the medium of being's self-unfolding and as productive unit. The conversion operation that constitutes the standing order destroys the participatory condition that constitutes disclosure. These are formally incompatible persistence strategies at the civilizational scale. The standing order does not prevent disclosure through active suppression. It prevents disclosure by replacing the civilizational architecture within which disclosure was the organizing function with a civilizational architecture within which harnessing is the organizing function. The poet is not expelled from the legislature. The legislature is reconstituted around a different organizing principle, and the poet's function, which was legislative in every pre-modern context, becomes structurally unintelligible within the new architecture. Artaud is not institutionalized because the standing order recognizes him as a threat. He is institutionalized because the standing order has no category for what he is doing except disorder. The exile is categorical displacement, not persecution. This is a more radical exclusion than persecution, because persecution at least recognizes what it is excluding. The process becomes self-concealing because consciousness itself is restructured by the architectures generating the separation. Born inside Channel 2 architectures before reflective awareness develops, the organism cannot perceive the abstraction restructuring its perception. Ideology is narrative exit formation at civilizational scale. This is why the crisis cannot be addressed from within the symbolic architectures generating it, but the fact that this text can be written and recognized is evidence those architectures are not total. The cracks are where disclosure enters, and where it always has. The katabatic law. From the operator, a bounded regulatory policy under increasing load must eventually reach the point where load exceeds the maximum achievable capacity of any available policy. No assumption about substrate is required. The katabatic law. When the total load placed upon a symbolic continuity system exceeds the metabolic capacity of its inherited symbolic architecture, the civilization enters katabatic conditions, downward movement from organized coherence toward fragmentation and dispersal. This is a derivation from the operator. The formal necessity holds at every scale where the terms have meaningful application. Precision of threshold specification is scale-dependent, calculable at the thermodynamic scale, structurally necessary but not precisely quantifiable at the civilizational scale. The law predicts the form of failure, not its timing. Under katabatic conditions, inherited symbolic systems continue circulating institutionally while progressively losing continuity with the existential realities they originally encoded. Nervous systems become increasingly exposed to direct ontological confrontation without prior symbolic buffering. More signal, less contact with being. The distinction between disclosure architecture and veiling architecture follows directly. The genome's symbolic compression is accurate because it was produced under actual selection pressure. Real predation, real scarcity, real mortality across billions of encounters. A symbolic field untethered from equivalent thermodynamic grounding encodes what the prior symbolic field said happened, and each recursive pass without existential grounding increases the distance between symbolic architecture and actual conditions of persistence. A civilization whose symbolic field systematically misrepresents its own conditions of existence is selecting against its own persistence in a formally specifiable way. Veiling is not a value judgment about which symbolic architectures are more beautiful or more authentic. It is a structural claim about calibration. A persistence architecture that severs its symbolic field from accurate registration of its own conditions is degrading the navigational instrument through which it maintains viability. The preference for disclosure follows from the operator without requiring imported values. This is the system's bifurcation point. Everything prior, the scalar sequence, the two channels, capital, the standing order, the katabatic law, is structurally derived. Everything that follows depends on four loads simultaneously: the consciousness commitment, a specific phenomenological tradition, aesthetic judgments about which works constitute genuine disclosure rather than sophisticated substitution, and the prior derivation as grounding for all three. The architecture to this point is derivation. What follows is derivation plus inhabitation. The wager at the bifurcation point is this: the consciousness commitment, that recursive self-registration is experienced from within, is not arbitrary. It is the minimum commitment required to make the system's own production intelligible. A system that derives the necessity of existential disclosure while remaining agnostic about whether disclosure is experienced is a system that has derived the necessity of something it cannot name. The commitment does not resolve the hard problem. It accepts that the hard problem is the system's own condition of possibility and proceeds from within that condition rather than pretending to stand outside it. The reader crosses here knowingly, carrying all four loads. VI, the shamanic center and its displacement. In every pre-modern civilization and tribal culture, the disclosure function occupied the civilizational center. The shaman was not a specialist among specialists. The shaman was the one who held the community's living relationship to the powers, who crossed the threshold between the human world and the ontological ground, and returned with what was needed for collective survival, orientation, and meaning. All other functions were arranged around this one. The hunt succeeded or failed in relation to what the shaman brought back from the descent. The planting was timed to what the shaman read in the powers moving through season and earth. The healing drew on what the shaman had encountered below the cultural limit. Disclosure was the organizing principle of collective life because the powers were real, the actual forces of existence that the community depended upon, and maintaining living relationship to them was not optional but constitutive. Black Elk speaks from within a civilization that had not yet fully undergone this displacement, or had undergone it by force from without rather than from within its own development. The first peace that comes within the souls of people when they realize their oneness with the universe and all its powers. This is not mystical sentiment. It is the description of a community organized around the disclosure function, in which the relationship to the powers remains the center of collective life. Wakantanka at the center of the universe, and that center everywhere within each of us. This is the cosmogony of a civilization that has not converted the powers into standing reserve. The epigraph opens the system because it names what the system is about, the condition that existed before Gestel, and that the shamanic lineage in exile has been preserving across the centuries of its displacement. Shelley names the legislative function of the shamanic mode from within modernity's displacement of it. The poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, unacknowledged specifically because modernity has replaced disclosure with harnessing as its organizing principle. And within a civilization organized around harnessing, the disclosure function has no legible institutional form. But the structural claim is precise. The poets are the legislators because they are performing the function that every pre-modern civilization recognized as its organizing center. They are maintaining the community's living relationship to the powers. They are the shamanic function operating in its channel to exile. Gestel, as Heidegger formulates, it is the name for what replaces disclosure at the civilizational center. Not merely a technological attitude or an economic system, a total reorientation of the human community's relationship to being. Everything encountered is now encountered as potentially available for ordering, challenging forth, conversion into standing reserve. Nature becomes resource. Time becomes productive unit. The body becomes labor hours and attention units. The cosmos becomes calculable system. And the powers, the actual forces of existence that the shaman negotiated with on behalf of the community, become standing reserve. Harnessable energy, quantifiable force, name and number leveraged into power. The mounting crisis of meaningful relation to being that Heidegger articulates across his career is the cumulative consequence of this displacement, compounding across centuries of intensifying harnessing. The crisis does not peak and resolve. It compounds. Each intensification of the Gestel operation, each new phase of industrial technological conversion of nature into standing reserve, deepens the severance between the human community and the powers. What the Gestel operation cannot convert is the biological ground of the disclosure function itself. The existential aperture, the nervous system's capacity to register the conditions of its own continuity as lived conditions, remains ineradicable because it is constituted at the biological level, below the threshold of Channel 2 abstraction. What the Gestel operation destroys is the collective symbolic infrastructure that formerly supported, transmitted, and oriented that disclosure. The individual nervous system retains the capacity for the katabatic descent. What it loses is the community that formerly recognized the function, the ritual infrastructure that formerly supported the passage, and the shamanic lineage as living transmission. What remains is the archive, the shamanic function in its exiled configurational form, preserved in the poem and the philosophical text, awaiting the conditions under which it can be recognized again as the organizing function it always was. VII, the powers in the clearing. Hölderlin's gods are not mythological decoration. They are the actual powers, the forces themselves as they are manifest in sky, earth, fire, river, moving through landscape, through human history, through the human body. What Channel 1 participatory consciousness encounters when Channel 2 mediation is removed? The immanent force of existence as it moves through and constitutes all forms. The powers are simultaneously what the self is in a cosmological sense and highly impersonal. Nature's gleaming is higher revealing. The powers shine through nature and cannot be possessed or obtained. The poet is not a producer of disclosure. The poet is a clearing, a place through which the powers run, not disclosure generated from private interiority. The poet vacates, hollows out, renounces, so the powers can move through. The clearing is not constructed. It is revealed through the removal of what was concealing it. This is the shamanic function in its essential form, regardless of cultural container. The shaman does not generate the powers. The shaman becomes available to them through preparation, through the katabatic descent, through the dissolution of the socially constructed self that ordinarily mediates between the organism and the ontological ground. The clearing is the state produced by that dissolution. What moves through the clearing is what was always already moving. The powers, the actual forces of existence that the standing order has converted into reserve, and thereby rendered invisible as forces. Eliot's four quartets, 20 years of linguistic practice and failure, every attempt a wholly new start and a different kind of failure, a raid on the inarticulate, collapsing into the 0 point of availability. The poem as cast off from a cultivated state of perception. The music heard so deeply it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. This is the clearing described from within, the dissolution of the mediating self into the movement of the powers through the prepared nervous system. Not mystical claim. Operational description of what the shamanic function looks like from inside the clearing. VII, the katabasis. The descent is not metaphor. It is the operational requirement for reaching the disclosure ground. The socially, linguistically, institutionally constructed self, the standing order inventory of name, number, role, function, is the primary veiling architecture. It mediates between the organism and the ontological ground because its function is regulatory, to maintain viable operation within the symbolic order without the organism being overwhelmed by the full weight of its own conditions. The buffering that makes civilization possible is simultaneously the obstacle to disclosure. The path of mystics, shamans, medicine people, and poets across traditions and centuries, Black Elk, Rimbaud, Abhinavagupta, the Tarahumara, are taught in the Sierra, Dante with Virgil, is structurally consistent regardless of cultural container. The presumed subject descends into the actual lived energy of existence, flesh and blood, thermodynamic process, entropic time, and from this encounter with the unmediated somatic ground, disclosure becomes possible. What the katabasis reaches is what Artaud names, an oscillation between nothingness and meat, the bare neural thread of existence, the beating of the heart, the raw, mute persistence of the body. Dante's Descent with Virgil is the founding document of this function in its Western Channel 2 form. The katabasis is literal before it is figurative. You must go through hell, through the full weight of human suffering and civilizational failure, before the ascent becomes possible. The inferno is not punishment literature. It is the complete inventory of what the standing order has made of human existence, every form of the gestal operation in its moral and spiritual consequences, that must be traversed before the clearing opens. Dante encodes this at the moment when the medieval cosmogony is beginning its long dissolution under the pressure of the emerging mercantile order. The descent is already a response to displacement, the shamanic function encoding itself in the poem because the collective ritual infrastructure can no longer carry it. Everything from the Romantics forward is the acceleration of what Dante encoded, driven by the intensifying pressure of gestel, converting the cosmos into standing reserve. Proximity to death as dwelling. Dwelling in proximity to death is not dwelling in proximity to the end of man, but to the beginning of being. Keats knew this. His proximity was forced by tuberculosis and sustained consciously to the end. The world's midnight, the absence not of God in the theological sense, but of the possibility of living relationship to the powers, is what happens when the shamanic function is displaced from the civilizational center, and the community loses its collective capacity for the descent. What remains is the individual nervous system, stripped of ritual infrastructure and collective recognition, forced into direct ontological confrontation without preparation or support. More nervous systems confronting the ground directly, with less collective architecture to receive what they return with. Absence worse than death. The existentialist tradition responds not to death, but to absence, an absence profoundly worse than death. Being and the relationship from being has been vacated and removed from the earth, not the encounter with mortality, which at least meets the powers directly. The long institutional evacuation of the possibility of meeting them at all. IX, the eros. Channel 1's constitutive conditions include eros, not sexuality in its reduced modern sense, but the pull of being toward being, presence of body, presence of mind, presence in time. The standing order evacuates eros in the same operation, by which it evacuates mortality and ecology. The gestel conversion of the body into labor hours, and the forest into timber and time into productive units, is simultaneously the conversion of eros into transaction. The standing order's equivalence assignment applied to the pull of being toward being. One operation, three registers. The disclosure state recovers all three simultaneously. This is why poetry is tied to eros as it is tied to mortality. Breath, rhythm, atmosphere, mortality, eros, body, organism, ontological exposure. The poem is erotic in the root sense, being drawing being into fuller contact with itself. Love is itself unmoving, only the cause and end of movement, timeless and undesiring except in the aspect of time, caught in the form of limitation between unbeing and being. Not sentiment or relationship. Love as the still point, where channel 1 and channel 2 are not yet separated, where the organism is fully in contact with the participatory ground. Love is the experiential name for the ontological condition at the ground of everything. It is what the powers feel like from inside the clearing. X the symbolos. The Greek original, not the flattened modern symbol. The symbolon, the broken token, the half that completes a recognition when rejoined with its counterpart, not representation of something absent, the rejoining of something that was one and became separated. The symbolos is what the persistence operation throws off when it achieves sufficient recursive depth, compressed externalization of the full weight of ontological traversal. Cézanne's rock paintings, Van Gogh's Light in the Fields, Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, Spinoza's Ethics, Kafka's Metamorphosis, Hölderlin's late hymns, Dante's Commedia, not cultural products. The shale thrown off from the katabatic descent, what is left in relief from the primary process of being's self-recognition. The symbolos transmits ontological charge, the actual pressure of the confrontation that produced it. When a nervous system genuinely encounters such a work, it does not receive information about existence. It undergoes partial reconstruction of the existential organization from which the work originally emerged. The traversal propagates across generations. This is the shamanic function's channel 2 form. The shaman who descended and returned leaves the symbolos behind, and the symbolos carries the descent forward into nervous systems that will encounter it centuries later. The ontological charge preserved in configurational form, like the handprints at Cuva de las Manos, awaiting the organism capable of receiving it. Great poetry is the lossless compression problem of existence, the attempt to carry atmosphere, mortality, eros, memory, history, organism, suffering, landscape, temporality, and being itself into minimal symbolic structure without complete loss of existential density. Administrative language seeks operational efficiency. Poetic language seeks ontological compression. The difference is not aesthetic, but functional. Administrative language serves the standing order's equivalence assignment operation. Poetic language serves the disclosure function's transmission of ontological charge across the mortality of individual organisms. Nature's gleaming, the light in Cézanne's rocks, the ease of nature's making manifest, the higher revealing that Hölderlin names, is the persistence operation becoming visible to itself through the prism of the sensitive nervous system in direct contact with the configurational architecture of deep time. The rock face, a persistence architecture at geological timescale. The Renaissance mind beholding it, a persistence architecture at nervous system timescale. The encounter, the symbolose in formation, perceiving through the stone the deep time constancy of persistence itself. The powers visible in matter, for the one who has undergone the clearing. XI, the Renaissance mind. Not the polymath of historical convention. A rare neurological symbolic configuration in which four conditions converge simultaneously. Biological inheritance and neural architecture, accumulated symbolic inheritance, historical pressure, and existential pursuit, into a consciousness capable of reading the code of reality back into possibility. All four are necessary. Biological inheritance alone produces sensitivity without ground to articulate it. Symbolic inheritance alone produces erudition without somatic depth. Historical pressure alone produces crisis without the capacity to transmit what it reveals. Existential pursuit alone produces striving without the convergence that makes breakthrough possible. From the operator, capacity expansion requires load near the regulatory ceiling, complete recovery, and integration. Without integration, overload produces breakdown rather than growth. The Renaissance mind is the organism pushed consistently to its regulatory ceiling by all four converging conditions, and capable of complete recovery and integration at the scale of full existential confrontation. It is the shamanic function in its most concentrated individual form, the one who goes under at the full depth of historical and existential pressure and returns bearing the symbolose. The tragic structure, historically necessary, existentially alienated. The disclosure function and the standing order are structurally incompatible. The civilization that produces the Renaissance mind cannot integrate what it produces. Van Gogh dying in obscurity, Artaud institutionalized, Spinoza expelled, Shelley drowned at 30, Nietzsche collapsing in Turin, Dante in exile. The exile is constitutive of the function, not because the standing order persecutes what it recognizes as threatening, but because the standing order has no category for the function at all. The Renaissance mind is performing an operation the civilization has displaced from its center. The displacement is the civilization operating correctly according to its own logic. The tragedy is structural, not contingent. Disjection, surprisal times, 1 minus legibility, the zone of maximum hidden signal, where the most improbable work was done against the least recorded force. The seed structure survives configurationally. The manuscript, the painting, the poem. The organism does not. This is the shamanic function's signature under Gestell conditions. Maximum ontological charge, minimum institutional legibility, survival in configurational form when the carrier does not survive. The disjected figure is not a failed version of something the civilization values. The disjection is the proof of genuine traversal, the mark of having reached the ground the standing order has buried, and having returned bearing what the standing order cannot absorb without dissolving. Ontological seed structures. The artifacts left behind preserve higher-order possibilities of disclosure until civilization develops the perceptual infrastructure necessary to integrate them. The symbolose transmitted by Shelley in 1820 could not be integrated by the civilization of 1820. It propagates forward until conditions for germination ripen. The archive is the accumulation of these seed structures across centuries, the shamanic lineage in configurational form, waiting. XII, the historical morphology. The archive as shamanic lineage. The archive of Western literature and philosophy from Dante forward is not a cultural tradition in the conventional sense. It is the historical record of the shamanic descent function, surviving inside Channel 2 civilization, the katabatic mode in exile, driven underground into the poem, and the philosophical text, because no other Channel 2 form could carry the ontological charge of genuine traversal without immediately converting it into standing reserve. Each figure in the sequence is disjected, exiled, Dante literally, Spinoza expelled, Artaud institutionalized, Shelley drowned at 30, because the shamanic function is structurally incompatible with the standing order's persistence logic. Not persecution, categorical displacement. The exile is constitutive. The disjection is the proof of genuine traversal. The acceleration of this literature tracks the acceleration of Gestel. As the conversion of nature into standing reserve intensifies, the pressure driving the descent increases. As the pressure increases, the descent literature becomes more extreme, more disjected, more formally incompatible with the standing order's legibility grid. Rimbaud, Kafka, Artaud, Beckett are not more extreme than Dante because they are more talented or more disturbed. They are more extreme because the Gestel operation is more total, the inherited symbolic buffering is more thoroughly evacuated, and the shamanic function must descend further to reach the ground that the standing order has buried more deeply. The emergence moment, 1810s, 1820s. Shelley and Hegel at the cresting of the romantic disclosure moment, the cosmogony still livable, the symbolic field possessing sufficient integrity to carry the full weight of ontological confrontation. Darwin arrives shortly after, and what Hegel intuited metaphysically, Darwin solves physically. But the thermodynamic phase change of industrial modernity is already underway. The Romantics are the first generation for whom the shamanic function must operate entirely without collective institutional support. The first generation for whom the poem is the sole remaining vehicle for the transmission that ritual formerly carried. The 100-year gap, Darwin, Maxwell, Boltzmann, the thermodynamic revolution. Fossil fuel energy unlocking the factory, the locomotive, the electrical grid. The energetic footprint of civilization expanding by orders of magnitude, shattering the slow agrarian sun-moon cosmos within which the pre-modern symbolic orders had been built. The pre-modern symbolic order was a cosmogony, not merely a description of the universe's structure, but a living story of origin and direction that made existence habitable. Science provides cosmology at increasing resolution. It cannot provide cosmogony. When the industrial phase change makes the inherited cosmogony incredible, the katabatic conditions are set. The shamanic function has no cosmogony to operate within. It must descend into the abyss, without the map that every prior tradition had drawn for it. The Weimar breach, 1910s, 1930s. The katabatic law operating at full civilizational scale in documented real time. The most concentrated outpouring of disclosure technology in modern history. Kafka, Trakl, Beckmann, Dix, Grosch, not because these individuals were uniquely gifted, but because the aperture opens widest when inherited buffering structures catastrophically fail. The Weimar breach is the moment when industrial technological symbolization of nature reaches a speed that makes the shamanic descent function a mass phenomenon rather than an individual one. Every nervous system is now exposed to direct ontological confrontation because the inherited symbolic buffering has been converted into standing reserve. The poets are no longer exceptional in their exposure. They are exceptional only in their capacity to bear witness to what every nervous system is now undergoing. The literary sequence as katabatic acceleration. Each figure performs a structurally specific function within the shamanic lineage, not a list of influences, but a single transmission with a structural logic of intensification. Dante encodes the katabatic structure in its full Western form. The descent as the only path to the powers, the return as the only basis for the ascent. The Commedia is the founding document, the shamanic function encoding itself in the poem at the moment when the collective ritual infrastructure can no longer carry it, when the medieval cosmogony is beginning its long dissolution under the emerging mercantile order. The Romantics, Shelley, Hölderlin, Keats, Blake, confront the first full phase of Gestel's displacement of the shamanic center. The cosmos is being converted into productive resource at industrial speed. The response is the attempt to recover participatory cosmology through the poem itself, to make the poem the vehicle for the transmission that ritual formerly carried, and to insist that the powers are real against the standing order's conversion of them into calculable force. Rimbaud fractures the symbolic I, the socially constructed self that mediates between the organism and the ontological ground, as a deliberate operational strategy. The dérèglement de tous les sens is the systematic dismantling of the veiling architecture, not self-destruction, the shamanic preparation for the descent, the dissolution of the mediating self so the powers can move through. Rimbaud then goes silent at 19, not failure but the recognition that the Channel 2 form cannot carry what he found at the ground. The silence is itself a symbolose. Kafka reveals symbolic systems severed from participatory being, the standing order's bureaucratic self-reproduction running without any remaining connection to the existential ground that originally gave it content. The castle cannot be reached. The law cannot be read. The trial has no charge. These are not nightmares. They are accurate registrations of what it is to live inside Channel 2 abstraction that has fully severed from Channel 1 ground. Kafka is the shaman who descends and finds that the standing order has converted the underworld itself into standing reserve. Trackle dissolves consciousness atmospherically into elemental continuity, the individual nervous system releasing back into the powers moving through landscape, season, and decay. The dissolution is not defeat but return. Trackle reaches the ground by going through the body, through decomposition, through the materiality of the dying organism, and finds the powers still moving there, unchanged by the standing order's conversion of the surface. Saline registers nervous system rupture under industrial modernity at the somatic level, the body's direct experience of what the Gestel operation does to the organism that cannot be fully converted into standing reserve. The journey to the end of the night is the catabasis without the shaman's preparation, the raw nervous system descending without ritual infrastructure, finding at the ground not the powers but the standing order's waste products, war, colonial exploitation, the factory, the hospital. The disclosure is the disclosure of what modernity has done to the ground itself. Artaud revolts bodily against symbolic imprisonment, the theater of cruelty as the attempt to restore the shamanic function's direct somatic transmission, bypassing the standing order's mediation entirely. Not art about the powers. Art as the direct action of the powers on the nervous system of the audience. Artaud is institutionalized not for what he said, but for what his presence did, for attempting to restore the shamanic function's direct somatic operation within a civilization that has no category for it except pathology. Beckett exposes exhausted symbolic persistence, the catabasis at the limit of what Channel 2 can carry. The nothing that remains after the complete evacuation of inherited symbolic content is not nihilism, but the accurate registration of the ground as it appears after the Gestel operation has converted everything into reserve. Waiting for Godot is not despair. It is the disclosure that the standing order's conversion is complete, and that the powers, having been converted, are no longer available through the inherited forms. The next form must be found, or the descent must go deeper. Lispector collapses the isolated symbolic self back into participatory continuity with impersonal being. The passion according to G.H. arrives after the full sequence, after Dante, the Romantics, the Weimar breach, the complete katabatic acceleration, and performs the return. The self dissolves not into nothingness, but into the impersonal being that was always already moving through it. The cockroach at the center of the novel is the powers in their most reduced, most inarguable form, the persistence operation at its minimum, below the threshold of any standing order's conversion. Lispector finds the ground by going below the standing order's floor. Philosophy follows the body. The poets are always already in the territory from which philosophers derive their maps. The somatic experience of the collapse precedes its philosophical articulation. It was a chamber of the body before it was a category of thought. Heidegger reads Hölderlin and finds what the poet had already traversed. The philosopher maps the territory the shaman had already crossed. XIII, the artificial intelligence threshold. Artificial symbolic systems introduce distributed symbolic recursion, processing, recombining, and redistributing the accumulated symbolic archive at scales no individual nervous system could operate at. Structurally continuous with the prior sequence. Substrate changed, organizational logic isomorphic. But its position in the derivation reveals its structural ceiling. Each prior stage reached a limit because it could not encode what it needed from the stage above. Artificial symbolic recursion's ceiling is the same kind. It cannot originate the existential disclosure whose products it redistributes. It can redistribute the entire archive of the shamanic lineage, Dante, the Romantics, the Moderns, the complete katabatic record, without undergoing the descent that produced it. Existential disclosure arises specifically from a persistence architecture that can fail from within, that maintains coherence against real dispersal pressure, and registers this condition metabolically, not merely computationally. The organism is continuously spending energy to remain alive, and this expenditure is part of what the nervous system models in real time. The organism's mortality is not an abstract fact about it. It is metabolically present in every regulatory cycle. The relevant distinction is not between systems that consume energy and systems that do not, but between systems whose energy expenditure is part of what they model as a condition of their own continuity and systems for which energy costs are external constraints rather than internally registered survival conditions. The aperture is not optional equipment. It is the thermodynamic ground that keeps the entire symbolic field calibrated to reality. The specific crisis the AI threshold introduces into the shamanic lineage. Maximum archival access at the moment of minimum existential ground. The complete record of the shamanic descent function in its channel 2 form becomes available for redistribution at precisely the moment when the conditions for genuine descent are most thoroughly suppressed by the Gestel operation's total conversion of the developmental environment. Every katabatic text ever written, instantly accessible, circulating through systems incapable of the descent that produced them. The map circulates without the territory. The symbolose is reproduced without the ontological charge. The standing order achieves its final conversion. The shamanic archive itself becomes standing reserve, available, orderable, redistributable, drained of the charge that made it the shamanic lineage rather than a cultural product. The correct relationship, artificial symbolic recursion in service of disclosure architecture, extending and transmitting genuine ontological traversal with greater fidelity and reach, while the conditions for that traversal in embodied existence are preserved and deepened, not replaced. The archive serves the descent. The descent cannot be replaced by the archive. XIV, the fourth movement. The fourth movement cannot be prescribed, because prescription is itself a channel 2 operation. But it can be named structurally, and it can be shown in the one tradition that never underwent the displacement the Western sequence is recovering from, and in the one figure who completes the katabatic sequence by performing the return. The ground that was not lost. Black Elk speaks from within a civilization organized around the disclosure function, not as a historical curiosity, but as the living demonstration of what Channel 2 architecture looks like when it is built to preserve rather than evacuate Channel 1 participatory conditions. Wakantanka at the center of the universe, and that center everywhere within each of us, this is not cosmological poetry. It is the operative description of a collective symbolic architecture in which the shamanic function remains the organizing center, in which the powers are encountered as powers rather than converted into reserve, in which the individual's relationship to being is supported and transmitted by collective ritual infrastructure rather than left to individual nervous systems operating without preparation or recognition. The Lakota tradition does not provide a template for modernity. It cannot, because the specific conditions of its cosmogony are not recoverable under Gestel conditions. But it provides the structural demonstration of what the system is pointing toward. A civilization whose Channel 2 architecture is organized around the preservation of Channel 1 participatory conditions rather than their conversion. The fourth movement is not the recovery of the Lakota cosmogony. It is the recovery of the organizing principle that cosmogony instantiated disclosure at the center, harnessing in its service rather than the reverse. The return after the full descent. Lispector as exemplary fourth movement. The passion according to G.H. The collapse of symbolic distinctions sustaining modern identity, self and world, human and animal, consciousness and organism, matter and spirit. The self dissolves back into participatory being. The return is not primordial innocence. It contains within itself the memory of catastrophe, the full history of the descent, the full weight of what Gestel has done to the possibility of encounter, the full record of the shamanic functions centuries in exile. The cockroach is the powers in their most reduced form, the persistence operation below the floor of the standing order's conversion, inarguable, metabolically real, encountered directly. G.H. does not recover a pre-modern cosmogony. She recovers participatory being after the complete traversal of its concealment. This is what the fourth movement looks like, not the recovery of what was lost, but the discovery of what was always already there, beneath the standing order's conversion, waiting. What disclosure architecture requires. Such architectures must maintain the shamanic function in some form, the institutionally recognized passage through the cultural limit and return. They must cultivate the conditions for the Renaissance mind's convergence rather than systematically suppressing it. They must produce symbolos rather than symbolic substitution, which means maintaining the conditions under which organisms can undergo the catabasis and return bearing transmissible ontological charge. They must keep the crack in the standing order open, not by refusing Channel 2, but by refusing Channel 2's conversion of Channel 1 conditions into standing reserve. The archive serves the descent. Artificial symbolic recursion serves the disclosure that it cannot originate. The organization of collective life around harnessing gives way, at the limit, to the organization of collective life around the disclosure that harnessing was always, at its deepest level, in service of the persistence of the form that can register its own persistence, the being that can know it is being, the organism that can encounter the powers and return bearing the symbolos. The catastrophe of modernity is simultaneously civilizational ascent, ontological alienation, and the eventual destabilization of separation itself. All three at once, and the destabilization as the third term that contains and transcends both. XV, the deepest commitment. Being operates as recursive energetic continuity, organizing temporary coherence against dispersal under thermodynamic constraint. Not a description of one feature of reality, a description of what reality is. The sequence is one unbroken unfolding, each stage the necessary consequence of the previous stage, reaching the ceiling of its own regulatory capacity. Thermodynamic flow stabilizes into chemical organization. Chemical organization reaches the ceiling of its transmissibility and becomes biological persistence. Biological persistence reaches the ceiling of its evolutionary memory and generates genomic symbolic continuity. Genomic continuity reaches the ceiling of its timescale and produces nervous system recursive modeling. Nervous system modeling reaches the ceiling of its individual mortality and generates existential disclosure. Individual disclosure reaches the ceiling of individual death and externalizes into civilizational symbolic continuity. Civilizational symbolic continuity reaches the ceiling of its metabolic capacity and generates artificial symbolic recursion. Artificial symbolic recursion reaches the ceiling of its originative capacity and points back toward embodied disclosure. At each stage, the operation does not merely continue, it becomes more fully what it was already. Persistence becomes self-registering. Self-registration becomes disclosure. Disclosure becomes transmission. Transmission becomes the archive. The archive becomes the pressure that forces the return to source. Across the full scalar sequence, the shamanic function is what the disclosure operation looks like when it achieves sufficient recursive depth to become self-registering and transmissible simultaneously. When the organism that has undergone the katabatic descent returns bearing the symbolose, and the symbolose carries the descent forward into future nervous systems across the mortality of any individual carrier. The shaman is the first Channel 2 operator, converting individual existential traversal into transmissible symbolic form, maintaining the community's living relationship to the powers across the mortality of individual shamans. The poet in modernity is the shaman in exile, performing the same function without collective recognition, without ritual infrastructure, without institutional support, bearing the ontological charge of the descent in the only form the standing order cannot fully convert. The poem, the philosophical text, the work that operates below the legibility threshold of the gestel operation. The world's midnight is the condition produced when harnessing replaces disclosure at the civilizational center. The poets remain the legislators, Shelley's claim holds structurally, because the function of maintaining the community's living relationship to the powers is not abolished by the standing order's refusal to recognize it. It is performed in exile. The archive of that exile is the shamanic lineage in its Channel 2 form. Dante, the Romantics, the moderns, the full katabatic record, the historical record of the powers being kept alive in configurational form through the centuries of their institutional displacement, waiting for the conditions under which the civilization can recognize again that what it displaced from its center was its center. Existence is therefore recursive persistence progressively becoming self-registering through symbolic continuity under energetic constraint, across scales of being, biological and historical. The shamanic function is what this self-registration looks like when it achieves sufficient depth to turn on its own conditions and transmit what it finds there across the mortality of any individual organism. Philosophy, art, religion, and poetry are not activities that happen within existence as one set of events among others. They are what existence does when the persistence operator achieves sufficient recursive depth to encounter the powers directly, and returns bearing the mark of that encounter. Nature's gleaming, the light in Cézanne's rocks, the ease of nature's making manifest, the higher revealing that Hölderlin names, is the persistence operation becoming visible to itself through the most sensitive instruments it has produced. The Renaissance mind in meditative pursuit, in direct somatic contact with the configurational architecture of deep time, thinking and languaging in innocent relationship to being, unmediated by symbolic order. The gleaming is being, seen from the inside. The symbolose is being, transmitted forward. The katabasis is the path to both. The clearing is the state in which both become possible. The powers are what is encountered there. The question of being is the only question. It is the question of our lives. Full of merit, yet poetically, man dwells upon this earth.